My name is Maggie Whitfield. I am 43 years old, and for 9 consecutive years, every single month, on the 4th of the month, I paid the mortgage on a house I will never own a single brick of. $1,140. Automatic transfer. Wells Fargo to Wells Fargo, account ending in 7742. From my checking account to the mortgage servicer for a brick rancher on Pintail Drive in Mechanicsville, Virginia. 9 years, 108 payments, $123,120 in total. I know that number because I have the bank statements. Every single one, going back to April 2014, organized by year in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in my home office. I kept them the way you keep evidence, quietly, without drama, without telling anyone, just a slow accumulation of paper proof that I had been there, that I had showed up, month after month, when no one asked me to, and no one thanked me for it. 3 weeks ago, I sat in a leather chair in a law office on West Broad Street in Richmond, Virginia, and I listened to a man named Philip Garrity read my parents' will out loud. My father's house, the one with my 7-year-old handprint still pressed into the cement of the back porch, the one I had been quietly funding since Barack Obama's second term, went to my younger brother, Connor Whitfield. The $41,000 in their joint savings account went to Connor. The 1998 Buick LeSabre I had detailed for my mother's 70th birthday went to Connor. The china cabinet, the dining set, the small collection of Virginia wildlife prints my father had framed over 20 years went to Connor. And to me, to Margaret Ann Whitfield, the eldest child, the one who had transferred $1,140 to that house every 4th of every month for 9 years, my parents left one sentence, typed in plain 12-point Times New Roman. To my daughter Margaret, I leave my love and my hope that she finds peace. I'm going to tell you everything. But first, I want to know who's listening. Wherever you are right now, whatever kitchen table, whatever couch, whatever break room or car or late-night bedroom, type it in the comments. Tell me your city and what time it is there. I think about that a lot. All these women, in all these different time zones, all these different living rooms, nodding along in the dark at a story that sounds too familiar. I want to know you're out there. Tell me where you are. Now let me start from the beginning, because the will is just the ending. The story started long before any lawyer's office. I grew up on Pintail Drive in Mechanicsville, Virginia, a quiet 2-lane subdivision 15 minutes outside Richmond, where all the houses looked vaguely alike, and everyone knew which families kept their porch lights on and which ones didn't. Our house was a brick rancher my parents had bought in 1986 for $98,000. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a sunken living room that always collected socks and remote controls, a kitchen with linoleum floors that curled at the edges near the dishwasher. In summer, it smelled like cut grass and my mother's gardenia perfume. In winter, it smelled like the forced air heat and whatever she'd had in the slow cooker since morning. My father, Walter Harold Whitfield, worked 31 years as a maintenance supervisor at the Honeywell manufacturing plant in Hanover County. He drove a truck, wore steel-toed boots, and kept a thermos of black coffee on the counter every morning that he finished in complete silence before he said a word to anyone. He was not a demonstrative man. He said, "I love you," the way some men say grace. Briefly, and only at designated moments. But he was decent. He fixed things when they broke, showed up to what he said he'd show up to, and had a particular code about women and capability. He believed his daughter should know how to change a tire, check her own oil, and read a lease before she signed it. Those were the gifts he gave me. Small ones, compared to what he gave Connor, but real. My mother, Diane Ruth Whitfield, née Patterson, taught 2nd grade at Bell Creek Elementary for 23 years, before bad knees and a doctor's note pushed her to part-time aide work at the preschool at Redeemer Lutheran Church. She baked. She joined the garden club. She remembered every birthday in the extended family, with a card and a phone call, and she ran our household with the kind of cheerful, organized efficiency that made her look effortless from the outside and invisible from the inside. She was not a cruel woman. I want to be careful to say that, because I know what easy stories about mothers look like, and this isn't one. She loved me. I don't doubt that she loved me. What she never learned, in 54 years of marriage and 2 children, was how to love me the same way she loved my brother, and she never noticed the difference, which is its own particular kind of grief. Connor Thomas Whitfield was born on a Wednesday in March 1987, and from that Wednesday forward, the atmosphere inside our house on Pintail Drive changed in ways that were imperceptible at the time, and that I only fully understood decades later. I was 4 years old when he was born. My mother tells a story about how I came to the hospital and kissed his forehead and said he was the most beautiful baby in the universe, and for years, she told it as though it were the sweetest story she knew. What she never seemed to notice was what the story revealed. Even at 4, even at the beginning, I was already orienting myself toward him, admiring him, making space. Connor was a colicky infant who became a clingy toddler, who became, somewhere around 3rd grade, the kind of boy that teachers loved unreservedly. He had a face that worked in his favor. Wide, earnest, brown eyes, a quick smile, the kind of energy in a room that made adults lean toward him without meaning to. My mother called it a light. My Aunt Carol, who came for Thanksgiving every year from Fredericksburg, and who smelled like white diamonds and red wine, called him an old soul. My father called him my buddy. They all said these things as naturally and as habitually as breathing, the way you say things about someone you've decided you love, completely without reservation, and the love itself became the lens through which they saw him, so that his failures read as struggles, and his struggles read as character building, and his achievements read as proof of everything they'd always known he was. What did they say about me? That I was responsible, that I was independent, that I was self-sufficient. These were not compliments dressed as observations. They were observations that had quietly become expectations. I was responsible because no one stepped in to carry anything for me. I was independent because no one offered to walk beside me. I was self-sufficient because the alternative, asking for help, needing something, showing a crack, had never been modeled for me as something that would be met with warmth. In 1998, when I was 15 and Connor was 11, my father was offered overtime hours at the plant and took them, which meant he was home less, and my mother managed the household alone most evenings. I cooked dinner 3 nights a week that year. Real cooking, not sandwiches, actual meals, whatever was in the fridge made into something edible. My mother thanked me exactly once, in a distracted way, while she was on the phone with her sister. Connor never once offered to help, and no one suggested he should. In 2000, my junior year at Atlee High School, I was taking 5 AP classes and working 12 hours a week at the cookout on Mechanicsville Turnpike to save money for college. Connor failed Algebra 2. He was a sophomore, and the failing grade came home on a progress report that my mother treated like a minor emergency. She called 3 teachers. She joined the PTA tutoring committee. She hired a retired math teacher named Mr. Pruitt, who had a gray beard and drove a powder blue Oldsmobile, to come to the house twice a week at $40 an hour and sit with Connor at the kitchen table. I watched this from the doorway some evenings on my way back from a shift, still smelling like grease, my AP chemistry textbook under my arm, and I did not say a single word about it. I didn't say a word because I didn't think I was allowed to. I had internalized, completely and without anyone explicitly telling me, that the rules were different for me, that I was the one who handled her own things, that Connor was the one who got handled. I got a 4 on the AP chemistry exam that spring. Nobody put anything on the refrigerator. I went to Longwood University in Farmville on a partial academic scholarship, $7,200 a year, and worked the rest out through a Pell Grant, a small student loan, and a shift at the campus dining hall 3 evenings a week. My parents gave me nothing beyond the scholarship years of praise that had softened, by then, to a kind of benign indifference. They said they were proud. They may have been, But they did not ask once, in 4 years, whether I needed help with the gap between my scholarship and my actual bill. Connor went to Virginia Tech 2 years later. Full ride, fully paid, no questions asked. 4 years of tuition, room, board, and a used Jeep Cherokee for the drive down I-81. When I asked my mother, once, just once, why the difference, she looked genuinely confused, the way people look when you point out something they've never once examined. Connor needed it, she said. As though I hadn't. I got my teaching license in 2005 and accepted a position teaching 10th grade biology at Hermitage High School in Henrico County. I made $38,400 my first year. I shared a 2-bedroom apartment in Lakeside with a woman named Priya, who was finishing her nursing degree at VCU. We split the rent, ate a lot of pasta, and watched reality television on a television with a cracked corner of the screen that neither of us could afford to fix. I loved that apartment. I loved it in the way you love your first truly independent thing, imperfect and entirely yours. Connor graduated Virginia Tech in 2009, took a job as a junior financial advisor at a firm called Meridian Wealth Partners in Charlotte, North Carolina, and over the course of the next several years, built a life that looked, from the outside, like everything. He married Brooke Callahan in the summer of 2011 at a vineyard outside Charlottesville, a wedding my parents co-funded to the tune of $22,000, an amount I only learned later, tucked inside the revelation about the second mortgage. He bought a condo in Charlotte's South End neighborhood. He started showing up to Thanksgiving in cashmere quarter zips and talked about clients with 8-figure portfolios with the casual authority of a man who had never once doubted that the world would keep making room for him. I liked Connor. I want to be clear about that too, because complicated love is still love. He was funny, genuinely funny, with a dry, quick wit that could make a whole room laugh. He was generous with compliments and remembered people's birthdays and genuinely delighted in his nieces and nephews on my cousin's side. He was not a bad person. He was a person who had been so thoroughly protected from consequence and effort that he had developed a blind spot the size of a house, specifically the house on Pintail Drive, and that blind spot would take a near tragedy to close. In March of 2014, on a Tuesday morning, my father had a stroke. He was 66 years old. He'd gone to get the mail at the end of the driveway, and a neighbor, a retired man named Gary Shiflett, who walked his dog every morning at 10, found him face down on the asphalt, the mail scattered around him, one arm folded beneath him at a wrong angle. Gary called 911. The paramedics from Hanover Fire Station 3 reached him in under 7 minutes. By the time I got to Henrico Doctors Hospital, 40 minutes after my mother's phone call reached me mid-class, a class I left with the lights still on and a room of confused 10th graders, my father was in the ICU, the left side of his face slack and unfamiliar, his speech a slow, effortful drag that made every sentence sound like he was pushing it through wet concrete. Connor was in Charlotte. He came up 4 days later. I am not going to be self-righteous about those 4 days, because I know that a 4-hour drive on no notice with a job and a new marriage isn't always a clean calculation. But I want to tell you what those 4 days looked like from my side, because I think it matters. I sat in the ICU waiting room for 6 hours the first night, the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in the color of exhaustion, the vending machine offering burnt coffee in paper cups that left a residue on my teeth. I called my mother every hour because she was alone on Pintail Drive and didn't drive on the highway after dark and didn't want to make a scene at the hospital, by which she meant she didn't want to see him hooked to all that equipment with nowhere useful to put her hands. I spoke to 3 different nurses, 2 residents, and a hospitalist named Dr. Yemi Adeyemi, who explained, patiently and thoroughly, what a left hemisphere ischemic stroke meant for a 66-year-old man in otherwise moderate health. 4 days later, when Connor arrived, my mother lit up in a way that I registered in my chest like a key being turned in a lock. I don't think she even meant to. I think it was purely reflexive. Her baby was there. Her crisis was shared now. Someone else was present to help hold the weight. She hugged him for a long time in the waiting room and cried into his shoulder, and I stood 6 feet away with a hospital discharge packet in my hands and did not say anything. The discharge meeting happened that same week. The hospital social worker, a woman named Renata Okafor, a brisk, kind Nigerian-American woman with reading glasses that she pushed up her nose with 2 fingers when she was thinking hard, sat across a conference table from me and my mother and walked through what happened next. My father would need twice-weekly outpatient physical therapy. He would need an occupational therapist to come to the house. The house? A rancher, yes, that was good. No stairs, still needed modifications. A stair lift for the one interior step into the sunken living room, grab bars in both bathrooms, a hospital bed that could be adjusted, at least temporarily, for the first weeks of recovery. And then Renata, in her businesslike and non-judgmental way, asked about finances. My mother, overwhelmed in the way that overwhelm looks when it's been building for days, opened her purse and handed it to me and said, "Maggie just handles things." I took the purse and found, inside it, a folded paper that turned out to be their most recent mortgage statement. I almost put it back without reading it. I didn't. The house on Pintail Drive, purchased in 1986 for $98,000, carried a remaining principal balance of $164,000. Not because my parents had been irresponsible, necessarily, but because in 2009, they had taken out a home equity loan, a second mortgage through Cardinal Bank, which had since been absorbed by another institution, to cover Connor's wedding costs, and a down payment check they had written to help him and Brooke purchase their South End condo. $22,000 for the wedding, $18,000 toward the down payment, $40,000 of borrowed equity wrapped into a variable rate second mortgage that had not been explained clearly to 2 people who had never navigated financial products more complicated than a car loan. I also found, in the purse alongside a grocery list and 3 loose Werther's Originals, a bank statement showing their joint checking account held $843. My father's disability benefits hadn't been processed yet. My mother's part-time church preschool pay was $1,100 a month. Their fixed expenses, mortgage, utilities, insurance, medications, ran $2,300 a month without the new therapy and home modification costs. I sat in my Honda Accord in the hospital parking garage for a long time after that meeting, both hands on the wheel, engine off. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and cold concrete. A pigeon walked in a slow circle near my front tire. I did math in my head until the math stopped moving. I was 34. I had just signed the papers on a 2-bedroom condo in the Fan District of Richmond. My first real home, $189,000, a down payment of $19,000 that I had assembled over 8 years of modest saving. My salary at Hermitage High was $54,000 that year. I had $6,200 left in savings after the down payment. That night, I called Connor. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear, in the background, the particular echo of a large kitchen, tile floors, high ceilings, and Brooke's voice asking something about whether they'd decided on the island waterfall or the standard edge. Their kitchen renovation, I later learned from my mother, had been quoted at $38,000. I explained the situation carefully: the second mortgage, the balance, the income gap, my father's recovery costs, the math. "I can send something every month," Connor said. "I want to help. Maybe like 200? Things are a little stretched right now with the renovation, and we just booked a trip to Cabo for Brooke's birthday, but I want to contribute $200 to a $2,300 a month household shortfall." While they finished their kitchen in Cabo, I thanked him. I hung up, and then I called Wells Fargo and set up the automatic transfer. $1,140 a month, starting April 4, 2014, from my checking account to the mortgage servicer. I told myself 6 months, maybe a year, just until my father's disability benefits were properly processed, until his recovery stabilized, until the household found its footing. I have told myself a lot of things over the years that turned out to be stories I was telling so I could keep going. 6 months became a year became 2. By 2017, my father was walking with a cane, and his speech had recovered to about 80%, a drag on his S sounds, a slight slowdown on words with hard Cs, and his disability benefits were coming in steadily, $1,840 a month, and my mother was still doing her church preschool hours, and Connor was sending his $200 about 4 months out of 12, because he kept forgetting to set up the automatic transfer, and things were always, somehow, a little stretched. They bought a 5-bedroom house in the Myers Park neighborhood of Charlotte for $890,000 in the spring of 2016. They had 2 children, a girl named Lila, born in 2014, and a boy named Beckett, born in 2017. They posted photos from Disney World, from a lake house in the Outer Banks that they rented for a week every August, from Panthers games in club-level seats, where Brooke wore a Cam Newton jersey over a Barbour vest. I watched all of it from the small couch in my condo in the Fan District, still paying my own mortgage on top of everything else, still driving the same 2009 Accord, still eating lunches I packed at home, because the math only worked if I was careful. Here's the thing about sacrifice that nobody tells you, because nobody talks about it honestly. It doesn't feel noble. Not after a while. In the beginning, there's a warmth to it, a sense of doing the right thing, the oldest child competence clicking into gear. I can handle this. I will handle this. This is what capable people do. But after 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, that warmth cools into something more like habit, and the habit wears a groove into your life, the way a river wears a groove into rock, quietly, invisibly, until one day you look and there's a canyon there, and you can't quite remember when the ground was level. I stopped contributing to my retirement savings above 3% in 2015 because I needed the extra money. I didn't go to my college roommate Nadine's wedding in Savannah because I couldn't justify the flight and the hotel. I ended a 2-year relationship with a man named Theo Marchetti, a contractor from Chesterfield, largely because, and these are his exact words, said gently on a Tuesday night in my kitchen with his coffee going cold, "I feel like I'm dating someone who's already given everything she has to somebody else. And I'm not sure I can wait for the parts of you that are left." He wasn't wrong. I was angry when he said it, and I wasn't wrong about that either. Meanwhile, at family gatherings, my contributions to the household had developed a name: nothing. Or rather, they'd been absorbed into the invisible infrastructure of the family, the way load-bearing walls are absorbed into a house. Essential, unnamed, admired by no one, because nobody looks at a wall and thinks about what would happen if it weren't there. I want to tell you about one moment in particular: Thanksgiving 2019. I had worked a half day at Hermitage grading lab reports, eaten a granola bar in the parking lot, driven 40 minutes to Mechanicsville, and walked through the back door of the house on Pintail Drive carrying a green bean casserole I'd made from scratch. Real cream of mushroom sauce, not the can, real French fried onions from the bag. Wearing oven mitts because I'd kept it warm on the passenger seat. I came in through the kitchen door the way I always did. And my parents were both in the kitchen, and Connor was leaning against the counter in a dark green quarter-zip sweater, laughing about something. A story about a client, some hedge fund manager in Charlotte who had said something ridiculous at a meeting, and my mother was laughing with her whole body, head back, genuinely delighted, and my father was shaking his head and smiling the particular smile he reserved for Connor, the one that meant, "That's my son." Nobody noticed me standing in the doorway for almost a full minute. I counted the seconds, standing there with a casserole warming my forearms through the oven mitts, the November air still cold on the back of my jacket, where I hadn't quite warmed up. 48 seconds. Then my mother turned and saw me, and said, "Maggie, honey, you're here." And it was warm, it was genuine, but it wasn't the same. It will never be the same as watching someone's face change when you walk into the room, and I have made my peace with that, but I won't pretend it didn't cost something. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think a lot of you know the exact feeling I'm describing. Was there a Connor in your family? A sibling? A cousin? Someone who just automatically received the warmth while you received the management? I'd like to know their name, if you're willing. Not because I want to reopen anything for you, but because I think there's something real about saying a name out loud to strangers, in a place where nobody knows your family, where no one will tell you you're exaggerating. Go ahead, say the name, I'll be reading. In the fall of 2021, I did something I had been quietly rehearsing for 2 years. I sat down on the back porch of the house on Pintail Drive with my father on a Sunday afternoon in October. The yard still holding the last of its color, the big oak losing leaves in slow handfuls, and I asked him directly about the will. I was careful about how I said it. I wasn't accusatory. I wasn't transactional. I said something like, "Dad, I've been helping with the house for a while now, and I just want to understand how you and Mom are thinking about things going forward, in terms of the property and everything else." I said it lightly. The way you say things when you're terrified of the answer. My father was quiet for a long time. He looked at the yard. He turned his coffee mug between his palms, the way he did when he was thinking. "Your mother and I have talked about it," he said finally. "We want it to be fair to both of you." Fair, that word. I turned it over in my mind for 2 years. Fair like what? Fair like acknowledging 9 years of mortgage payments? Fair like splitting a house whose equity I had built dollar by dollar? I didn't ask him to define it because I was afraid of what the definition would be, and I think some part of me knew, even then, that the definition and my definition were not going to match. I should have asked. I should have sat with my discomfort and asked him exactly what he meant by fair, in the specific language of deeds and dollars and decades. I didn't. I nodded and said, "Okay," and poured the cold end of my coffee into the yard. In March of 2023, my mother fell. She was getting up in the night to use the bathroom, and she misjudged the edge of the bath mat, and she went down hard on her right hip. She broke it clean. The surgery at Bon Secours St. Mary's went well, and her recovery was slow but real. A walker first, then a cane, then a slightly altered gait, and a new habit of reaching for walls when she moved through dark rooms. But the fall frightened everyone, and it frightened her in a particular way that I recognized. It had reminded her that her body was something that could be taken from her. My father's cognitive decline, which had been moving at a pace so gradual it was easy to explain away, a forgotten name, a repeated question, the stove left on twice in January, quietly accelerated that spring. Not dramatically, not in the way it announces itself in movies, with a dramatic scene and a diagnosis over a desk. It happened the way the tide comes in. By the time you notice it, you're already wetter than you thought. I was driving out to Pintail Drive 3 times a week by April. I managed their medications, a pill organizer for each of them, color-coded, refilled on Sundays when I came for dinner. I drove my mother to her physical therapy sessions at Bon Secours twice a week and sat in the waiting room with a stack of lab reports to grade, working through them under the fluorescent waiting room lights, while the therapist put my mother through her exercises in the next room. I hired a part-time home health aide named Yolanda Baptiste, a warm, efficient woman from Martinsville who had been caring for elderly clients in Henrico County for 11 years, at $22 an hour, 8 hours a week, paid out of my own checking account, because my parents' insurance covered almost nothing in the category of preventive aid care. Connor visited that spring. He came on a Saturday in late April, took my parents to Olive Garden on Staples Mill Road, ordered the tour of Italy, and posted a photograph on his Facebook page that I saw because my cousin Stacy had liked it. My parents on either side of him in a restaurant booth, my father's face a little unfocused in the particular way it had become, my mother smiling her full smile, Connor's arm around both of them, caption reading "Quality time with the folks, har." 41 comments. People telling him what a good son he was, what a heart he had, how lucky his parents were. I read every comment the way you read a wound, slowly, because it keeps hurting. My father died on an October night in 2023, in his bed in the house on Pintail Drive. Peacefully, in his sleep, the way everyone hopes to go and so few people do. He was 75. I had talked to him on the phone the evening before, a shorter call than usual, because his attention had been drifting by late evening for months, but he had said my name clearly at the end, said, "Good night, Margaret," which was what he called me when he was being deliberate about something, and I had said I loved him, and he had said it back, and I have held on to that exchange like a coin I will never spend. The funeral was at Bennett Funeral Home on Atlee Road, a modest, carpeted place with silk flower arrangements and a guest book with a blue pen on a chain. Connor flew in 2 days before and gave a eulogy that made the whole room cry. He talked about fishing at Lake Anna, about Saturday morning pancakes with blueberries, about my father teaching him to throw a spiral in the backyard on Pintail Drive. All of it true. All of it his, because he had been allowed to just be a son, had not been required to also be the invisible infrastructure. I sat in the front row and I cried too, because grief doesn't negotiate, and I loved my father, complicated and imperfect and insufficient love and all. My mother died 8 months later, June of 2024, a heart attack, alone in the house, found by Yolanda when she arrived for her Tuesday shift, and knocked twice on the back door, and got no answer. I got the call at 6:14 in the morning. I drove to Henrico Doctors Hospital. I identified her. I filled out the paperwork. I called Connor from the hospital parking lot, and he was in Charlotte and said he'd get a flight, and I said okay, and I sat in my car for a while before I started the engine. She was 73. She had planted tomatoes 2 weeks before she died, in the raised bed my father had built for her in the late 90s, a raised bed that I had maintained for the last several years, because neither of my parents could comfortably kneel anymore. The tomatoes were just starting to come in when we cleared the house. 3 weeks after her funeral, Philip Garrity's office called. I drove to West Broad Street on a Wednesday morning in late July, wearing the clothes I wore for parent-teacher conferences because they were the most professional thing I owned that still fit correctly. Philip Garrity had a quiet, orderly office, the kind of office that communicates competence through restraint, with diplomas on the wall and a credenza and a yellow legal pad he wrote nothing on while he read. He was 60-something, white-haired, in a gray suit. He read the will slowly and clearly, pausing after each clause. I won't walk you through every line. I'll tell you what mattered. The house on Pintail Drive, appraised in the spring of 2024 at $312,000, fully paid off as of August 2023, because 9 years of my $1,040 a month payments had retired the second mortgage and settled the primary balance, went to Connor Raymond Whitfield. The $41,000 in their joint savings account went to Connor. The Buick LeSabre, the china cabinet, the Virginia wildlife prints, the dining set, the garden tools, the contents of the house, all to Connor. To me, my love and my hope that she finds peace. I asked Philip Garrity to repeat the clause about the house. He repeated it. He looked the way lawyers look when the document they're reading is legal and the outcome is indefensible, which is a specific kind of discomfort they're professionally trained to make minimal and personally trained to carry home with them. He told me the will had been last revised in February 2023, 9 years and 10 months after I'd set up that automatic transfer, 7 months before my father died. I want to stop here and ask you something real. If you had paid $123,120 over 9 years toward a house where your parents still lived, a house that was paid off entirely by your contributions, and you sat in a lawyer's office and found out it had been left to someone else while you received a sentence about love and peace, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have said something? Sat silent? Walked out? Would you have cried? Or would you have gone somewhere past crying, past the place where your face does anything at all? Tell me in the comments. I mean it. I want to know who you are and what you would have done, because I think the answer tells us something about ourselves that no one ever asks us directly. I sat still. I said thank you to Philip Garrity. I walked to my car. I drove home to my condo in the Fan District, my own mortgage, still running, the one I'd been paying alongside my parents for 9 years, and I sat on my couch in my work clothes as the afternoon went to evening, and the evening went to night, and I did not turn on a single light. Around midnight, something shifted. Not dramatically, not a single turning point, more like a thermostat clicking over. I felt, very clearly, the math of my life. Not the bank account math, though I had run those numbers so many times they lived behind my eyes like wallpaper. I mean the deeper math. The math of what I had paid versus what I had been paid back, not in money, but in recognition, in care, in the basic acknowledgement that my presence in this family had cost me something and been worth something to them. And the answer, when the midnight clarity gave it to me, was that the ledger had never once been balanced. Not once. Not a birthday card that mentioned what I'd done. Not a conversation at a holiday dinner where someone said, "You know, Maggie's been carrying something real." Not a paragraph in a will, not a line, not a word that said she was here. I did not contest the will. Let me be specific about why, because I know some of you are already thinking about the courtroom version of this story. I consulted an attorney, a woman named Selena Okonjo Reyes, who specialized in estate litigation and had an office in the Carytown neighborhood of Richmond, above a frame shop, accessible through a door that stuck in the humidity. She told me that I had a documentable financial claim. 9 years of bank statements showing direct payment to the mortgage servicer was, in her words, compelling evidence of unjust enrichment, which is a real legal concept. She said undue influence cases were difficult to prove, but that the size of the financial contribution and the complete omission from the estate created a strong equitable argument. She said, "If you want to fight this, Maggie, I think you have something real to stand on." I sat with that for 2 weeks. I ran the scenarios. And what I ultimately understood was that fighting for that house, a house I had funded for 9 years and never been allowed to fully belong to, a house where I had stood in doorways holding casseroles while my brother got the room lit up, would require me to spend more years of my life inside a story that had already taken enough of them. The house was not the thing I needed. The thing I needed was to stop being the person who put everyone else's ceiling over her own floor. I called Connor instead. He answered on the third ring, the way he always did, punctually enough to seem attentive, never so fast as to seem anxious. "Hey, Mags," he said. Mags. A nickname I had quietly disliked for 30 years and never corrected because correcting it felt like a confrontation, and I had never been given permission to take up that kind of space. "I need to talk to you about the will," I said. There was a pause. "Yeah." His voice had the particular flatness of someone who has been waiting for a conversation and is now relieved it's started and scared of where it goes. I was surprised too. Honestly, I didn't know they'd done it that way. "Did you know I paid the mortgage?" A longer pause this time. "I knew you helped out some." Helped out some. I absorbed that. I thought about how a fact gets smoothed into something manageable by repetition and distance, and the specific mercy of not asking questions whose answers would require you to do something. I thought about how my mother had told Aunt Carol, "Maggie just handles that," and how that phrasing had traveled forward and arrived, intact, in Connor's understanding of 9 years of my financial life. $1,140, I said. Every month, April 2014 through August 2023, 108 payments. $123,120. That's just the mortgage. That doesn't include the home health aide, Yolanda, $22 an hour, 8 hours a week, for 14 months. The silence after I said that number was very different from the earlier silences. It had a texture. It had a shape. "Maggie," he started. "I'm not calling to ask for the house," I said. "I'm not calling to ask for anything from the estate. I'm calling because I need you to know what I know, and I need you to know that I know it, so that whatever happens between us from here on out isn't built on your not understanding what you're standing on." There was a long quiet. Then Connor said something I didn't expect, not in the content of it, but in the honesty, the stripped-down plainness of it. "I think I always knew, Mags. I think I let myself not think about it too hard, because thinking about it too hard would have meant I had to do something about it, and I never did." I just, I let you handle it and I told myself it was because you were better at it than I was, and I'm pretty sure that was a story I told myself because it was easier than the truth. It wasn't an apology in the full sense, it wasn't the acknowledgement I had, in some private part of myself, needed for years. But it was the most honest thing my brother had said to me in perhaps 15 years, and I found I could hold it, carefully, the way you hold something fragile that still has some value left in it. I told him I needed space. Not forever, but real space. I needed a period of time in which I was not required to show up at his table and receive a smaller portion of the room's warmth while he received the larger one. He didn't argue. I think he was relieved to be given permission to sit with what he'd just heard, instead of having to process it while simultaneously pretending everything was fine. I want to tell you about what came next. The part that isn't the dramatic pivot. Not the lawyer's office, not the phone call with Connor, but the slow, genuine, sometimes ugly, sometimes luminous work of rebuilding the inside of your own life after you've finally put down something you've been carrying so long you forgot it was weight. I stayed at Hermitage High School, room 214, 16 years in that room by that point, with its cracked lab counters and its smell of whiteboard cleaner, and the bulletin board I updated every unit with new student-made diagrams. My department chair, Renata Pruitt, a different Renata from the hospital social worker, just one of those coincidences of small Virginia communities, had been something like a sister to me for a decade. She had showed up at my father's funeral with a covered dish and a card she'd had the whole department sign, and she had not asked a single question about the house or the will or any of it, just set the dish on my counter and held me for a minute, and that was the right thing, the exact right thing, and I told her so later. I started therapy in August of 2024. My therapist was a woman named Dr. Imani Caldwell, who had an office on Patterson Avenue, with hardwood floors and a sycamore tree visible through the window, that changed color magnificently through the fall. In one of our early sessions, Dr. Caldwell asked me to describe my role in my family system in a single sentence. I sat with that question for close to 5 minutes, long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer, and when I finally spoke, what came out was, I was the proof that things were okay, even when they weren't. Dr. Caldwell wrote that down. She said, "Tell me more about that." And I did. Over the following months, in that room with the sycamore tree and the floor that creaked near the window, I began to understand something that I could not have articulated before. My 9 years of mortgage payments hadn't only been keeping a roof over my parents' heads, they had been sustaining a fiction. The fiction that the Whitfield family was fine, that nobody was in over their heads, that Walter and Diane Whitfield had raised 2 successful children who were managing beautifully, thank you, one of them visibly and one of them invisibly, and wasn't that proof of what good parents they'd been? My invisible contribution had been the machinery behind the visible tableau. And the machinery doesn't get credited. The machinery just runs. Now I want to ask you something that I've been thinking about since those early sessions with Dr. Caldwell. Was there someone who showed up for you in the way Renata Pruitt and Dr. Caldwell showed up for me? Someone who wasn't family, who didn't owe you anything, who just appeared and said, quietly or loudly, "I see you." A teacher, a neighbor, a colleague, a friend? Tell me about them. Tell me their name, or just tell me what they did. I don't think we say thank you to those people enough, even in comment sections, even to strangers. Go ahead and tell me about yours. In the spring of 2025, I sold my condo in the Fan District. The Richmond market had been generous to me. I walked away with $94,000 in equity after 9 years of ownership, 9 years during which the value of that condo had climbed while I'd been too financially stretched to have noticed. I put a down payment on a house in the Museum District, 3 bedrooms, a sun porch that caught the afternoon light like a greenhouse, and a backyard with a magnolia tree already tall enough to provide real shade. I remember walking through it with my real estate agent, a woman named Priya Banerjee, who had been my friend since we were roommates in Lakeside in our 20s, now a licensed agent with 15 years of experience, and standing in the empty living room, no furniture, just light coming through the west windows, and breathing. long and slow and unstructured. Nobody else's name was going on this deed. Nobody else's bill was coming out of my account to sustain this property. Mine. I started dating that summer. Slowly, the way you do things when you've learned, through experience, that fast is a way of avoiding yourself. I met a man named Desmond Carter at a faculty mixer for Henrico County teachers in September, hosted at Deep Run High School in a gymnasium decorated with balloon centerpieces that had already begun to droop by 7 o'clock. Desmond taught American history at Highland Springs High School. He was 45, soft-spoken, recently divorced in a quiet and undramatic way, with a 16-year-old daughter named Aaliyah who spent every other week with him and made exceptional banana bread, which I learned about before I met her because he mentioned it in the first 10 minutes of our conversation as though it were a credential. He was unhurried in a way I had never experienced from a man before. Not passive, not avoidant, just genuinely at ease with a pace that had room in it. On our third date, at a small Ethiopian restaurant on Broad Street called Konjo, over injera and tibs and a candle that kept threatening to go out, I told him the whole story. The mortgage, the will, Connor, the lawyer's office, the sentence about love and peace. I told him everything, the way you eventually tell the truth to someone you've decided to trust, all at once, without editing. He listened without interrupting. He didn't offer a verdict on my parents or Connor. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, 9 years. Every month, and nobody said thank you. He said it not as a question, and not as an accusation of anyone, just as an acknowledgement. Just as someone seeing a thing clearly and naming it plainly, and something in me that had been held very rigid for a very long time, something I had not known I was still clenching, released. I cried, there at the small table at Konjo, for the first time since the lawyer's office. He held my hand across the table and let me cry without trying to fix it, and that was exactly right. I want to be honest about the in-between period, the months between the lawyer's office and the magnolia tree and Desmond, because I think honesty about the middle is what's missing from most stories like this one. There were nights when I lay awake in my new house and felt the old ache return, not for the house on Pintail Drive, not for the money, but for the simpler, older thing underneath all of it. The 8-year-old standing in the doorway, wondering what kind of light she had. Healing doesn't proceed cleanly. It doubles back. It gives you 3 good weeks and then a bad night that lands you back in the parking garage with your hands on the wheel. I want you to know that, if you're somewhere in the middle of your own version of this. The doubling back is not failure. It's the process. It's just slower than anyone tells you. The reversal in this story, and there was one, I'm getting to it, did not come with a courtroom or a public confrontation or anything dramatic. It came quietly, the way the most real things tend to come, on an afternoon in November, when I almost didn't answer the phone because I didn't recognize the number. It was Brooke. I hadn't spoken to my sister-in-law directly in almost a year. Connor and I had settled into our agreed-upon distance, the occasional text, no holiday dinners, no pretense of normalcy until things were ready to be normal. Brooke had sent a brief, kind text after my mother's funeral. She was sorry, she was thinking of me, and I had responded, and that had been that. She was crying when she called. The kind of crying that makes speech incomplete, that arrives in pieces between breaths, so that what she was telling me arrived in fragments I had to assemble while she spoke. Connor had lost his job. Meridian Wealth Partners, the Charlotte firm he'd been with for 14 years, had been under SEC investigation since January. Not Connor personally, nothing that would follow him legally, but the firm had collapsed under the weight of it, and 42 financial advisors had been cleared out in a Friday afternoon email in March. He'd been looking since, quietly, not telling anyone, certainly not posting about it, the silence about his own situation so total and maintained that it struck me, when Brooke said it, as the mirror image of the silence I had maintained about his family's situation for 9 years. He had finally understood something about what it costs to be the one holding up appearances, and then, 3 weeks before Brooke's call, Connor had had a heart attack. He was 39 years old. He had been at a Panera Bread on Providence Road in Charlotte, eating lunch alone, reviewing his resume on his laptop, when the pain started. He'd called 911 himself, which the paramedics later told Brooke was the reason he was still alive. A lot of people wait to be sure. He was taken by ambulance to Atrium Health Carolinas Medical Center and was in surgery within 40 minutes of arriving. He had a stent placed in the left anterior descending artery, which the cardiologist described as a widowmaker event, with a survival rate that depended entirely on how fast you got there. He survived. He was in recovery at Atrium when Brooke called me. The medical bills, already stacking at $34,000 before insurance, and their insurance had lapsed in the gap between his job ending and COBRA coverage being activated, were the immediate crisis. The house in Myers Park was 2 mortgage payments behind. Their savings, which had always been thinner than their lifestyle suggested, were nearly gone. Brooke said, "I didn't know who else to call." She said it the way you say things you have practiced saying and still can't quite get out cleanly. I held the phone for a moment. I thought about the house on Pintail Drive. I thought about 123 time, $120. I thought about Maggie just handles that. I thought about the sentence in the will, the one about love and peace, and I thought about how my parents had not been malicious, had not, I truly believe, made a deliberate decision to erase me, but had simply, over decades, allowed the path of least resistance to run entirely in one direction. I thought about what it would mean to step back into my old role, to be the solution again, to be the invisible mechanism again. And then I made a decision that was not about Connor, not about punishing him or rewarding him, but about who I was and who I was going to continue to be. "Which hospital?" I said. I drove to Charlotte the next morning. 3.5 hours down I-85, coffee in the cup holder, NPR, until I lost the Richmond station, and then just the road and my thoughts. Desmond had offered to come. I told him I needed to do this part alone, and he understood, because he was the kind of person who understood that kind of thing. I walked into Connor's hospital room and found him in a bed by the window, pale and diminished in the specific way illness diminishes people who are accustomed to taking up a particular amount of space. No quarter-zip sweater, no client stories, just my brother, scared, in a hospital gown, with a cardiac monitor tracing green lines behind him, and a half-eaten cup of hospital jello on the tray beside him. He looked at me and started to cry before I had fully crossed the room. I don't mean politely. I mean the way men cry when they have held everything in for a very long time and the holding finally gives, roughly, completely, with his hands over his face like a child. "I don't know how to ask you for anything," he said, from behind his hands. "I don't have the right. After everything, I don't have the right." I pulled the visitor's chair close to his bed and sat down. I did not tell him it was okay, because some things are not okay while they are happening, and naming them correctly is more honest than smoothing them over. I said, "You don't have to have the right. You're my brother and you're scared. That's enough of a reason to be here." I stayed for 3 days. I did not offer to pay his mortgage. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because I know what some of you are waiting for. The version of this story, where I step back into the role I had spent 9 years dismantling, and that is not what happened, and it's not the version of this story I want any woman who is watching this to think is required of her. What I did was sit with him. I talked to the cardiac team and took notes. I helped Brooke navigate the financial assistance office at Atrium Health, a patient advocate named Tamara Welch who was direct and practical, and got their bill reduced to $7,200 with a structured payment plan. I connected them with a financial counselor named Gerald Okafor, the son of the hospital social worker who had helped me with my parents' discharge planning 11 years earlier, which is the kind of full-circle coincidence that happens in real life and sounds invented in stories, who spent 3 sessions with Connor and Brooke going through their actual numbers and helping them see that the Myers Park house was not sustainable, and the sooner they made a clear-eyed decision about it, the better. They sold the house in Myers Park 9 months later for $847,000, cleared what they owed, and bought a smaller house in the Plaza Midwood neighborhood of Charlotte for $394,000. A house they could actually afford. A house that was theirs in the way that a house you can actually maintain without performance is yours. It was a kind of starting over. Smaller, realer, less gilded. I think, watching from the outside, that it was the best thing that ever happened to Connor. Not the heart attack, God no, not the job loss, but the forced confrontation with what his life actually cost, and who had actually been subsidizing the version of himself he'd been presenting to the world. He recovered slowly. Cardiac recovery is not linear either. He went back to work in January 2025, at a smaller regional firm in Charlotte, a more modest position than before, with a salary he actually mentioned to me in conversation, the way you mention something real, rather than something curated. We talked once a month at first. Careful conversations, finding the footing, like learning to walk on a surface you've always skated over before. In April 2025, about 8 months after my visit to Atrium Health, Connor called me on a Tuesday evening. I was at my kitchen table in the museum district, the sun porch lit up behind me, the magnolia tree visible in the backyard in its first spring bloom, Desmond in the kitchen making something that smelled like garlic and olive oil. And Connor's name came up on my phone and I answered it. He said he wanted to do something about the will, about all of it. About the fact that he had inherited a fully paid-off house whose equity had been built entirely by his older sister over 9 years, and that he had accepted that inheritance while she received a sentence about love and peace, and that he had known, on some level, that something wasn't right, and that he had spent the better part of a year lying in a hospital bed and then slowly reassembling his life in a smaller house in Plaza Midwood, understanding what it actually felt like to need help and receive it, and he did not want to be the person who had received $123,120 of care and returned a sentence in a will. He put $60,000 into a savings account in my name. Not the full amount, he said so directly, without hedging. I know this isn't everything, Maggie. I know it doesn't reach it, but I want it to be a real number, not a gesture, something you can do something with. I took the money. I want to be clear about why. Because I think it matters. Not because it erased anything. Not because it squared the ledger. But because there is a difference between forgiveness and acknowledgement, and what Connor was offering was acknowledgement. Not dressed in excuses, not wrapped in a story about how he hadn't known, but plain, concrete, specific, a number in the language he understood best, and the language I had been speaking silently for 9 years. I took it because refusing it would have been a different kind of pride, and I was done performing. About a year after the hospital, I went to Lila's 8th birthday party at Connor and Brooke's house in Plaza Midwood. A small backyard party, streamers in the oak tree, a grocery store cake with a unicorn on top, Lila's school friends running through the sprinkler in their clothes by the end because nobody had planned for that, and nobody tried to stop it. I stood at the edge of the yard with a cup of lemonade and watched my niece blow out her candles and felt something in my chest that wasn't forgiveness exactly, and wasn't joy exactly, but was something in the early architecture of both. Something real being constructed, slowly, out of what had been cleared away. I want to pause before I finish and ask you something that I have genuinely wrestled with, because I don't think there's a clean answer. If your sibling came to you, not with words, not with an apology wrapped in excuses, but with an actual concrete attempt, imperfect, insufficient, real, would you accept it? Or would the years of being overlooked make the gesture feel like too little too late? I think about this a lot. I think the answer varies depending on where you are in your own story. Tell me honestly. I'll read every comment. I am standing in my kitchen in the museum district on a Tuesday evening in July of 2025 as I tell you this. The sun porch is catching the last of the afternoon light and turning it gold. The magnolia tree in the backyard dropped its last white blossoms 2 weeks ago and is now dense and green and entirely itself. Desmond and I got married in April, a small ceremony at the Bowling Haxall House downtown, 50 people, Aaliyah holding flowers and radiating the particular dignity of a teenager, trying not to cry. Connor came. He stood up during the toasts, nervous, fidgeting with the folded napkin in his hands, and he said, "My sister spent 9 years making sure our family had a roof over their heads, and none of us thanked her properly until it was almost too late. I'm doing it now. I'm thanking her now, in front of everyone, because she deserves to hear it out loud, not buried somewhere in a sentence about love and peace." The room went quiet. I cried. The good kind, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you afterward, that just passes through you and leaves the air cleaner. I sold the house on Pintail Drive. I mean, Connor sold it, but he split the proceeds with me without my asking, $156,000 each after fees, and I used my half to pay off the remaining mortgage on the Museum District house in October. I sat in my kitchen with the paid-in-full letter from my lender and read it twice, and then I put it in the manila folder in the filing cabinet next to 9 years of automatic transfer statements, because I wanted them all in the same place, the evidence of everything it cost and the evidence that it was finally, fully mine. I planted a magnolia sapling in the fall, a small one, grown from a cutting from the front yard tree. Knee-high, thin, not what it will become yet. I planted it in the backyard corner where the light is best, and I water it on Sunday mornings, and I think about the fact that the tree I planted will outlast me, and will be here long after anyone remembers what it cost me to tend the house where someone else's tree grew. I think that's okay. I think that's more than okay. Here is what I know, standing in this kitchen, in this house, with this marriage and this magnolia, and this ordinary, extraordinary, entirely mine Tuesday evening. The sentence my parents left me, my love and my hope that she finds peace, was the one true thing they said about what they wanted for me, even though they never figured out how to help it happen while they were alive. I found the peace. I found it by finally, fully, putting down the role of load-bearing wall. By deciding that invisible was not the same as unimportant, and that a family's inability to see me was a failure of their vision, not evidence of my worth. If you see yourself anywhere in this story, if you have ever been the one who transferred the money, made the casserole, sat in the waiting room, filled out the paperwork, driven the 40 minutes, all without anyone saying your name out loud, the way they said someone else's, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in that lawyer's office? What did your family's version of Maggie just handles that sound like? Leave it in the comments. I mean it. And if you want more stories like mine, the description has everything you need.